Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hey there, everybody. Jim Henson here. Welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the last week of June. I'm happy to be joined again this week by my colleague, Josh Blank. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
You have enough water over there?
I have just enough water.
Okay. We want to keep things equal here. Are you ready for the 4th of July?
Pumped.
That's because you're a patriot.
I am a patriot.
I find 4th of July is always an underestimated holiday in some ways. New Year's Eve, expectations always way too high, never met. 4th of July, particularly in Texas, excruciating heat, fireworks, decks.
Yeah, you just grill.
Just grill a bunch of food.
Just grill and hang out.
And gossip about politics, which we'll start doing today. So we want to start today with a Texas angle on a story in the national headlines, and that's the ongoing thrashing in the U.S. Senate over health care and a bill to do something with health care and Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, and especially Senator Ted Cruz's role in it. The senator's been getting a lot of press over a somewhat odd set of moves for him, maybe, and you've been pretty interested in this, right, Josh?
Well, I'm always interested in Ted Cruz. I'm in the Ted Cruz business, and so having kind of followed him from the beginning, and watched his brand sort of, form and blossom and really, take hold through the presidential run to now, it's really interesting to see where he's found himself in this debate. And he either is or he's being portrayed as kind of the conciliator in this, and this sort of odd role in that he's both one of the people outwardly against the bill, did so early with a group of 3 other sort of conservative senators saying that they weren't able to support it currently, but is also being portrayed as the one who's going to get them over the finish line in some ways. And this kind of goes back a month or so, where this kind of started coming up, this idea that Cruz was the guy. And it was because basically they were apparently holding the meetings where they were hashing this out behind closed doors. Apparently those doors were his doors, and it was his conference room. But what's kind of become even more apparent is maybe he wasn't actually in those conferences. They were just using his office, because he didn't seem to be any further out on the bill than anybody else.
And all the other people that were complaining about not knowing anything.
Right. And so he's been out there kind of saying, how do we get to yes has been his kind of thing. He's got sort of 4 points about how he gets to yes. But what's kind of really interesting to me about this is, one, it's odd because his brand was actually made kind of on being, an insurgent who wasn't going to play, by these sorts of rules. And 2, being one of the major proponents and one of the major forces against Obamacare, right? And now he's sort of trying to adjust, a bill that people are called Obamacare Light, or that really kind of extends or continues a lot of the Obamacare provisions, and that he's going to come in and somehow save it. It's just a very odd...
Yeah, he's talking like he's a getting to yes kind of guy now. And I guess just to provide background for people, Ted Cruz was elected in 2012. He had been Solicitor General, and he was kind of one of the intellectual political leading lights of the Republican conservative movement in Texas.
The Tea Party movement.
He rose very much as a favorite, of the Tea Party conservatives. He beat somebody that was not an incumbent U.S. senator, but beat somebody that was an incumbent stateholder, David Dewhurst, who at that point was lieutenant governor, had a lot of money, and was seen as kind of the heir apparent to win that Senate seat. Cruz comes not out of nowhere, but certainly out of comparative obscurity by rallying the conservative base, wins in 2012, and then goes to Washington and immediately becomes one of the strongest voices of conservative opposition, not just to the Obama administration, but he runs very much on this argument that's very familiar now. I think he might even have used the drain the swamp term when he ran. The idea that things were just broken in Washington, D.C., and that there was absolutely no value in getting along to go along, that he was there to shake things up. And that's why, as we talk about this, having Cruz be the guy going, well, we're just working to try to make something happen here. Very odd.
Outside of Texas, he's far more known probably for the 2013 government shutdown over Obamacare,
right,
and calling Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell a liar on the Senate floor than he is for any sort of legislative accomplishments or his ability to work with colleagues. I mean, if anything, his inability to work with colleagues is probably one of his most known traits nationally. So the idea that now all of a sudden he's being portrayed as this conciliator, it's an odd thing for, one, just having followed him this long, and then also just, his brand. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me about this is, to the extent that he's obviously welcomed this and invited, I mean, he even had an interview at the Tribune, I think a couple weeks back, where he, used the dreaded C word, compromise, right, over this bill. So how much does he own the outcome, which he really has no control over? Because part of the issue here is that he sort of has been the leading voice for the conservatives who are against this bill. But the conservatives are a little bit less of a problem than the Republicans from either moderate states or states that have expanded Medicaid, or even less moderate states, but sort of rural, poorer states like West Virginia and Alaska that need these Medicaid dollars to make their healthcare systems run, where those senators have also said they can't really push forward. So anything that Ted Cruz really gets that's going to bring him along is actually going to drive it further away from these people. And I, sort of the question I pose kind of just for, thought here is, does this do anything to his brand going forward? Does this represent a permanent shift to the way that Ted Cruz sees his role as a Texas senator? Or is this just, the politics of the moment and, and taking the opportunity?
I think that's the big question. I think, as we've talked about the poll in the last couple of weeks, Ted Cruz has very strong numbers among the most conservative factions of the Republican Party, and has very negative numbers among Democrats writ large. Always has, but they got even more negative after he ran for president. I mean, for Democrats to know Cruz more was to hate him.
Right.
And there's nothing too unusual about that. But I do think, you raise a good question. I mean, my sense is, my expectation would be, we'll see him play this out. It's very unstable. Who knows how it's going to end? I think it's most likely they get nothing. And Cruz can point to this as one example of when, that he's not completely disagreeable, but that in short order, he will find something else or another couple of sets of issues where he will try to get some visibility being some version of his old self.
Yeah.
But it does raise, broader questions about public opinion in Texas and how Republican conservatives or conservative Republicans position themselves. Like, is there an outer bound at which point people kind of say, well, at some sense, I can only go so far out on this before I've got to at least backfill a little bit in a more institutionally agreeable way. Yeah. And it's an open question.
Yeah. And, and the answer also for his actions could be really simple, which is just, it's different being, in the minority versus the majority. And, it provides opportunities and that kind of thing. I mean, the other thing is what's also interesting is that he's not feeling the pressure that a lot of other Republican senators are feeling from governors in states that have expanded Medicaid. One, Texas hasn't expanded Medicaid. Two, there's no statewide elected Republican official here who, has really made any notable mention about what the Senate's been up to on healthcare, as far as at least that I've read. And part of that is because in a lot of ways, for Texas, I mean, the real sort of big thing that has been driving this is sort of the cuts to Medicaid and how many people will lose coverage under those cuts over time and immediately, right? And in Texas, Medicaid is just, it's a poison pill in general. Yeah. I mean, it's basically big government welfare spending. But there's a sort of a reason for that, which is it's just such a huge part of the Texas budget. Right. I mean, even so far that, in this legislative session, the legislature kept cuts in place that they had made in the last session, which lowers basically the fees paid for therapists for children with disabilities.
Right.
Children with disabilities. That's what people would scream.
And if you feel politically safe in cutting something like that, you're tapped into something.
Yeah. I mean,
that is out there, and I think even the so-called moderates in the Texas House, with very few exceptions, nobody really stood up, and complained about that when that cut was made in the budget. Right. We should say, Medicaid federal program, winds up operated by the states with some funding and usually complicated rules and formulas for matching funding and things like this, and while the Democrats complained kind of loudly, when those cuts were made in the budget, that wasn't something that the majority party really debated very much. I think the speaker said something about hoping in the future that there would be some renegotiation. But the renegotiations with the federal government, the conservative baseline here really is a desire to minimize funding in programs, social funding programs.
And the overarching
like this.
environment here is the fact that they didn't face a real serious backlash over it. I mean, the optics of it were terrible, right? And they kind of were, and I think they reacted to that initially, but they haven't really faced a backlash over it. And also Texas, historically and continues to have one of the highest uninsured rates in the country. And it's not, it's not like anyone's running Republicans out of office here on account of that.
Yeah, no storming the ramparts on that. Okay, so on another topic, but sort of at the
we're in Texas now,
right? Also at the intersection of federal policy and state politics is right up to this morning. There have been recent hearings in the lawsuits against SB4, which was the anti-sanctuary cities law that also included the so-called "Show Me Your Papers" provision, as well as a new set of rules that prohibited cities from limiting police departments in their enforcement of federal immigration law.
Right. So basically, in particular, the idea is a sanctuary city is one that won't cooperate with immigrations and custom enforcement. So immigrations and custom enforcement says, oh, you have this person in jail, we'd like to talk to them, or we want to deport them, or whatever.
So will you hold them?
Hold them for us. We'll be there eventually.
Sometimes.
And this really does depend. I mean, this is one of the big issues here. If it's a big city, they're probably coming by every 48 hours. If it's some rural county, it
could be a while before they get out there
and pick this person up. And so some, cities had sort of passed, it basically created policies that allowed for, let's say not 100% cooperation, and Austin being the most obvious. But technically, no cities in Texas were actually sanctuary cities. It's not actually really a term that has a clear definition.
It's more of a term of art than...
Right. Yeah. So, some people could believe Texas is full of sanctuary cities. Other people could say there are no sanctuary cities here. Seems that
depends on your definition.
Yeah, we could get into that, but let's not. So anyway, but the hearing started this week, and there are a couple interesting things about these hearings. I mean, the first is where does the public stand on this? And let's just this kind of our bailiwick here. So let me just real quick, which is overall in terms of requiring local law enforcement entities to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. That's approved by 58% of Texas voters, but by 86% of Texas Republicans. Similarly, allowing police officers the right to check immigration status during any sort of basically detainment. So this could be whether someone's arrested, it could be during a traffic stop. Basically, anytime a police officer has a reasonable right
for a broken tail light, et cetera.
Yeah. They can they can check on immigration status, or at least they can't be prohibited from checking on immigration status. Right. That was supported by 53% of Texans and 87% of Republicans. So as far as where the state is on this, slight majority favors both of these provisions. Overwhelming majorities of Republicans favor these provisions. The interesting thing that's kind of about what has happened is that pretty quickly after this law was passed, the cities in Texas, all the major cities except for Fort Worth, basically started deciding whether they were going to fight the state on these laws. Now, their arguments, could be myriad, but the most direct one is that it's sort of another kind of, unfunded mandate. It puts them into precarious legal situations that they're going to have to then defend themselves against. They have to hold these people for some amount of time.
It's a drain on resources.
It's a drain on resources. And there's further arguments about whether these laws are good or not. Most of the police forces are against being immigration
particularly the
agents.
Big city police chiefs for the most part.
But the interesting thing in some ways about this, and sort of bringing this into the bigger picture here, is that this is sort of seems like a pretty big escalation of sort of this city versus the state dynamic, right? We've seen some sort of small things where, Austin passes a plastic bag ban. Denton passes a ban, against fracking, right? And then the legislature comes in and says, no, you can't do that. This one's kind of interesting because this isn't, this bill, first of all, isn't necessarily, those called sanctuary cities, isn't necessarily directed specifically at the cities, right? I mean, it's just directed at any sort of law enforcement agency in the state. But what's interesting is that all the cities at once, say Fort Worth, have said, we're going to basically band together and try to fight this. And that seems like a pretty big escalation on this city-state dynamic. Why do you think that's the case? Is it this issue or is it just everything?
Well, I mean, I think it's, this issue is a really convenient spot for the people that are fighting the cities and the state for, the governor is leading the effort, really, when you come right down to it, to be direct. But because public opinion is so one-sided, and it also has this federal piece to it, which is a little bit unusual.
It's very unusual
for this, because it actually involves the state government kind of siding with federal authorities and federal laws when it's usually the other way around.
Right, they're actually ceding a certain amount of discretion to the federal government.
But I mean, I think you've gotten at why this is, happening in this front. It's, Republican public opinion is so on the side of the people that are pushing these policies that it's a winner. And we saw this in the legislature. If you go back to when they passed this bill, this was one of the bills, during the legislature, there were all these fights between different factions, a lot of them inside the Republican Party. This was a Democrat-Republican fight, period. And it underlines, just how urban the Democratic Party is now.
So is that why Republicans don't like the cities?
Well,
because they're just so Democratic?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think it's a lot of different things. I think there is this developing theory among Republicans that state government and should be the preeminent sort of arbiter of laws, rules, and by extension of kind of what the state is like. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the cities are populated by Democrats is a big piece of it. The flip side of that is that Republican constituencies are largely rural, largely suburban, and there's a lot of points of friction with the cities, whether it's, financial over taxes and over cost.
Annexation.
This issue of annexations, cities going in and, arguably without much checking or without local permission. Annexation is when the cities go and they claim land that's adjacent to the cities and assert jurisdiction over people there and the tax base.
Usually they're providing services before that point, which is part of the
flip
argument.
Point is, they're also, it's usually an argument about cost or some other kind of functional need of the city, right? So I think there's a natural dynamic here that is reinforced by the politics as they've sorted out in the country and in Texas that makes sense here. And we're going to see we're going to see a lot of these issues coming up in the special session that's going to start in a couple of weeks. Yeah,
I mean, setting aside the, let's say people's policy preferences or, moral feelings or anything about this SB4 fight between the cities and state, this is not a good issue for the cities to pick to unify against the state against. I mean, just thinking about it and what we said, laying out those numbers, a majority of the citizens of the state sort of support these provisions. It was pretty clear going into the legislative session that like a sanctuary cities bill would be passed. A lot of times when, it seems like sophisticated players know if something's going to happen, then you say, well, how can we limit the damage?
Right. And
in this case, the city's response was to just basically be against it. And then it got worse and worse and worse. And now they're going to fight it in courts. And it seems, I only play a lawyer on podcasts. But it seems like really highly unlikely that the courts are going to overturn this. On any of the grounds they're kind of talking about. Just in terms of the fact that the cities are creations of the state. Potential discrimination is really hard to rule on. Discrimination by police officers, real, imagined, future, past, extremely difficult to prove. All these issues, it just seems, the unfunded mandate thing,
Yeah, I think the discrimination grounds is probably the best bet they're going to have, but probably not until there's evidence of it. So, in other words, to preemptively get it thrown out before there's evidence of things happening is going to be difficult, I think.
Yeah, well, and the other side of it, too, is that, with the way that, police can use discretion in applying laws, you actually have to usually show the intention. It basically gets down to the point where a police officer almost has to say, I did this because this person was Hispanic.
Right.
That's basically what you need to prove discrimination, and that's going to be pretty much non-existent.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. So, I think we'll see more on that. That said, I suspect, right now the status is there's been a stay ordered by a judge. Mm-hmm. In a federal court. There's a hearing in Austin before the federal judge here who's been in the middle of a ton of different things, Judge Sam Sparks. Mm-hmm. He's been in the middle of redistricting cases,
judge
abortion.
Playing cards, because these judges come up again and again. If you follow
and Judge Sparks has been in the middle of a lot of stuff. So we'll watch that and we'll talk about that next week. I want to close with one more kind of Texas proper thing, and Ross Ramsey's been on this podcast for the last 2 weeks.
Local
Ross,
celebrity.
He's a local celebrity among the geek crowd. But Ross has a piece in the Tribune that was, who says when anything is published. It appeared on the web, I think, technically last night, but Tuesday night or Wednesday night, Thursday morning. And it's called "A Governor Belatedly Setting the Legislature's Agenda," in which, Ross looks at the special session looming up and kind of makes the argument that Greg Abbott is really trying to drive the agenda very actively. He's finding bill sponsors. They're visiting actively with members of the legislature.
Yeah, and even the process by which he's going into the, he hasn't called a special session yet. Everybody knows the first thing is going to be this sunset bill to keep agencies open, and then he's going to trickle them out, the other sort of calls as it goes along to control exactly.
Right. And Ross makes a very insidery kind of mention that, by sequencing the bills that way or trying to, it's almost as if he passed his own rule. And by rule, he means, the way that legislation is structured in the legislative process. So it's a little suggestion that the governor's asserting himself in the legislature. And we've talked about this a little bit here. But not to argue with the wise old owl of the Texas Tribune.
He knows a lot. I would be very reluctant to.
Yeah, and, I'm pausing. But it does seem like, Ross is missing the institutional piece here a little bit. And he's not the only one. I mean, I think there was a discussion that went on that we've talked about a lot during the legislature where people kept complaining that Abbott wasn't assertive enough, that he wasn't present. But it does seem to me that he's picking his spot, and Ross does make the argument that it's kind of a unique play. I just think, as you mentioned before we were talking about this, and I'll mention this as use in case Ross hears this, that there is a little bit of a straw man here. The idea that Abbott somehow was extraordinarily weak or underplaying his hand in the session, when frankly, he does have a lot more leverage now, and he's using it. The Constitution doesn't give him a lot of leverage during the session, right?
Right. I mean, I think that's the thing that's been going on. I mean, throughout, you kind of mentioned it, but I'll reiterate it, is there's been this sort of somewhat quiet to, moderately loud rumbling about, Greg Abbott's sort of ineffectiveness at the beginning of the session and sort of during the session. And it's an odd thing because the governor has just this limited set of powers, right? He can declare emergency items and then people can act on them or not. I mean, at that point, right? He has no power over whether bills get assigned to committees, what happens to them, whether they get passed, whether they make it through the calendar. And so this idea that during this period in which he has zero control over what goes on,
at least formally,
in a co-equal branch,
right? That
he's going to, that he's somehow being ineffective by not, putting himself out there more. It's just always an odd argument.
Yeah.
And so to sort of contrast now where he actually does have the constitutional powers to call the special session, call it when he wants, call it as often as he wants, and specifically tell them the only things that they are allowed to work on
are these things.
That in and of itself is a really interesting use of the power that he has at this point in time, but in no way compares to the power that he didn't have basically for the entire session up until this point, right? I mean, that's just not the same thing. Right. It is interesting looking ahead, though. I mean, Abbott was, I think, in his first term during the session, or the first session after the 2015 session, he didn't call a special session. It wasn't really, I mean, there was some grumblings, but there's always kind of some grumblings. Everybody who doesn't get what they want kind of wants a special session. He didn't do it. I don't think he wanted to. He wanted to show business as usual, on that first term, new lieutenant governor, new governor.
Right.
It's going to be interesting to see, one, how this plays out, whether it works in the way that he thinks it's going to, which is in some ways to kind of assert himself as, in people's minds at the end of the session is the one driving policy in the state in a way that the lieutenant governor has been trying to do the whole time, basically. It'll be really interesting to see, assuming he's governor again, which is a safe assumption right now, whether this becomes a ploy of his going forward. I mean, I think the one thing that Ross said that I really liked was, it might be addictive.
Right.
I mean, once you realize that you get to basically control everything at this point in time.
That could be a bug that becomes a feature.
Yeah.
Right. In software terms. Yeah. I mean, I think that, part of the point, I guess, of raising this too is that, for people that are, if you start following these things and you're, as a consumer of media, there's a there's a habit in political coverage to very quickly and in the moment pick winners and losers in the moment, and then it winds up shifting really rapidly. I mean, it goes back and forth. I mean, so if in 5 weeks they conclude the special session and of the 19 items, what's the number at which this was a successful ploy or an unsuccessful ploy? Or is it a number? Is it just if they pass, a few of the things that have gotten the most media coverage, then can you declare victory and exit the field? Or do we have a whole other round of stories about how weak and ineffectual Abbott is and how this was a bad play? And I think, you often have to really step back and think about this as not being a game that necessarily has such a fixed set of winners and losers and how important it is to focus on that, or whether it's more important to get a more nuanced understanding of how a bunch of different things, especially the rules and institutions, function in this play, in this field.
And that's a good point. And, and that's something I think, it sort of parallels what's going on at the national level, actually, to bring it back to the beginning, right? A bunch of Republicans at the national level right now, senators, are sort of looking at the way that Trump celebrated with, Republican House members in the Rose Garden after passing that bill, and then, a few weeks later called the bill mean. Yeah, called the bill mean, right? And so, I think so this week when they basically decided they weren't going to vote on the healthcare bill this week in the Senate, Trump basically pulled all the senators, all the Republican senators to the White House to basically talk about it. And the attitude, it's interesting reading sort of the different takes on how those meetings went, but the attitude coming out of it was, well, we can't really trust this guy to have our back, even though he's pushing us and saying that he will. And what's interesting here is there is some talk about that with Abbott with Republicans too in the legislature right now. There's some idea that he's made some veiled threats in the 2015 session that he never really followed through on. Didn't really go out and do a lot to support incumbent.
Right. He made both veiled threats and promises that in the Capitol community, at least the gossip sort of is, the general feeling is he didn't go out and campaign for candidates in the legislature. And your sort of point that, there is, just sort of look in the moment and say winners, who's the winner and who's the loser is kind of the wrong way to look at it. And the other way, the reason it's kind of the wrong way to look at it is this is what we call, a repeated game. Right. The House members are looking at the House members and the Senate members, especially the Republicans in the House, are looking at the governor and looking at his demands and saying, okay, well, what happens if we do half this? Does he call us back for another session? Does he call us back for 3 more special sessions? When do we get to the end of this? But also, they're looking ahead a couple months, basically, some number of months into the campaign season and thinking, if I'm helpful, is he going to help me? If I'm not helpful, am I going to, face any sort of retribution? And everybody's kind of doing this in this environment that's constantly moving and evolving in a way that's going to be, it's going to be interesting. I think, the governor's getting a lot of credit right now for the way he's kind of taking charge of the session before it starts. It's a little less clear to me how he ends this, as you brought up, and what that looks like both for him going forward, his relationship with these other actors and players in the process, and, basically how it's all received and when everything is said and done and people try to evaluate this, not necessarily as a winners and losers thing, but kind of like, so what does this mean going forward? Yeah, I think the thing to notice institutionally about this is that in a way that I think is more pronounced than we've seen in the last decade, certainly during the Perry period, there's a lot of clear branch to branch antagonism right now. The legislature and the executive branch are not getting along, and they're and it's much more in the open. That's always there, but it's much more in the open right now with the governor having called the legislature lazy and the legislature feeling like the governor doesn't deliver for them.
Yeah.
So we'll know a little bit more about some of these issues next week. That's it for this week. Thanks for being here, Josh. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back. Have a good 4th of July, a safe 4th of July. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project and the Project 2021 Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin.